Okay, good morning. This is another in the series of ISBL podcasts. I'm Stephen Morales, Chief Executive of the Institute of School Business Leadership, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Hayley Dunn, ASCL's School Business Leadership Specialist, and Natalie Arnett from NAHT, Policy Officer and Lead on School Business. I'm going to hand over to you to both Hayley and Natalie, and they'll give you a more detailed introduction and explain a little bit about their background and their current roles. So, Hayley, if you could go first, that would be really helpful.
No problem at all. And just to start off to say thank you so much for the invite to join you today. It's an absolute pleasure. So hello, everybody. My name's Hayley Dunn and I'm ASCL's School Business Leadership Specialist. I've been with ASCL now for 2 years within this role. And prior to that, I worked in schools. So I've been a school business leader in a primary school and as a finance director in a multi-academy trust. So completely understand all the challenges and the wonderful opportunities there are working with education and working with young people. And prior to that, I trained as an accountant within practice. So that's my sort of background, how I sort of ended up coming into the world of education.
Thank you, Hayley. And Natalie?
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen, and hello to everyone. And thank you for inviting me along today. Yeah, as Stephen said, my name's Natalie Arnett. I work in the policy team at NAHT, and I've been looking after school business leaders and supporting our members for the last couple of years in my current role, and then previously in a policy research kind of capacity at NHT as well. So I've been there sort of nearly 5 years now, and then previously working in other public sectors in terms of policy and research as well. And I work really closely with members on our School Business Leaders Council to kind of guide and discuss and promote some of the issues and focus for our members over the last 5 years.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So today we're going to be exploring the different roles that unions and professional bodies play, the way they support their members and the relationship that respective groups have with government. So I'd like to start, if I may, with Hayley, and just if you could give me your perspective on the difference and perhaps even the similarities between representative bodies and professional bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an interesting topic, and just reflecting before we starting recording of moving from a sort of corporate background into the education and public sector background, and how different those sort of organisations and those sectors are in terms of the roles that professional associations and unions play. Coming from a corporate background, unions, professional associations don't particularly play such an important role as they do within education. And I think that's something that's really key and really important, because if we look at the range of professional associations and unions, because within some sectors there's only one choice, that actually I think that's one of the real positives within education, that there is choice, there is a place for the majority of people working with education to go with an organisation that will align with their values. But I think what I wanted to start off with was just to bring it back with some first principles in terms of the role of unions. So ASCL is a legal entity, is a trade union under the TULCA, which is the Trade Union Labour Relations Consolidation Act. And this sets out fundamentally how we can operate alongside the role of ACAS, which plays a statutory function within the role of the TULCA as well. Because to be a trade union, you have to be registered with the certification officer, you have to provide member support and be able to do collective bargaining, which fundamentally professional associations don't do. That's something quite unique to the role of unions. And if we look at employers, they have a statutory duty to consult with us, and there are arms of government that also have a statutory duty to consult with us as well. And as I said, the core business of trade unions is the member support and the collective bargaining, whilst also being able to do some of the functions that professional associations also do, such as guidance, information papers and professional development. And I touched on the role of the certification officer, which I think is a really vital function, because that has the ability to take complaints or to interject where due process isn't being followed. So if, for example, if you looked at an example like the appointment of general secretaries, there's a really rigid process that has to be followed, and ultimately that organisation, that function, has the powers to decertify an organisation if they're not following the process that they should be. And that's really important as well, that as members of organisations, that they've got somewhere to go to as well within the process.
We've actually been joined by Jon from Unison. Welcome, Jon.
I'm Jon Richards. I'm National Secretary for Unison for Education, Local Government and Police and Justice. And I look after our policy and bargaining and strategy for education workers within Unison. We have about 350,000 members working in education, and about 250,000 of those work in schools.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. So Hayley, thank you very much for that, for those reflections. I think you raised some important points. You make some important points. I'm going to hand over to Natalie now, if she could offer a similar perspective to that question.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Hayley. I think Hayley's obviously, NHT is also a registered trade union. I think Hayley's very eloquently outlined kind of the legal and the kind of the framework around how trade unions work, and touched on some of the relationships with government. I think in terms of obviously as a trade union, and our kind of core value is about representing and protecting members' interests, and we're the voice for our membership. And it's really, there's obviously some very clear ways that government can and needs to engage with us and consult with us. But there's also, we work, very closely with partners and with other trade unions as well, on some of that softer engagement and some of that kind of general conversation and debate and kind of influence with government to kind of make sure that members' views and experiences are kind of heard and incorporated and improved within the system. So I think that's kind of important. I think as well, recognizing that within the organisation, we work at different levels. So obviously, in terms of policy, I work kind of at a national level with national policymakers and with government, but equally, we have representation, and we're representing members at the local level, working with local government and employers there, and protecting members' interests. So I think there's definitely that kind of different levels of kind of support and engagement that we need to kind of be picking up and covering as well.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. And finally, the same question to Jon. I mean, what we've been discussing really is that distinction between a representative body and a professional body, and whilst we all work very well together, the emphasis is slightly different. And just interested in your perspective on that distinction.
Well, Hayley and Natalie did a fine job in explaining most of the things we do. I mean, for Unison in particular, we have national collective bargaining for pay and conditions for school business professionals and for others. It's our responsibility to bargain with what's called the NJC, which is the local government employers do bargaining on behalf of national employers and all those who are linked with that, which are the vast majority of academies as well. So our role is to go in and to bargain to try and get the best deal around pay and negotiations, and work locally to improve terms and conditions, as well as on top of the disciplinary grievance and the standard rights that trade unions are there for. And clearly, we believe that members are vital to this whole process. I think what's really important is the democratic processes which allow members to feed into policy and which allow us to represent it. I think that real linkage between what members think and how we react is vital to the process. And I think that makes us different from many other membership organisations where, you know, the AA or insurance companies or legal companies which are just responding to questions and needs. Our core is what our membership does and what our membership thinks and how we represent those as a wide collective. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to offer my my perspective. Clearly, you know, we're in this group of four. We're the outlier, so we are the professional body rather than the representative body or the union. And for me, you know, our core purpose centres around. Well, first of all, there needs to be a reference point, and professional standards are that reference point. And everything that we do, it needs to be underpinned by that set of professional standards and professional expectations, from entry level all the way to the most senior practitioners. And I think it's important I make clear that we don't have an emphasis either way. So we're not skewed towards only the most senior practitioners, and nor do we develop a proposition that only accommodates the most junior members. That the idea is the portfolio covers that very broad church, and it's important that we continue to support all the versions, and there are many versions of school business leadership out there. So we know our responsibility is to have oversight of those professional standards, to make sure that there's a range of qualifications that are accessible to our members, and that we ultimately support people through a career journey, recognising that some will have quite lofty ambition and some will have more modest requirements. And all of that is to be celebrated. What we don't do, and what we're not equipped to do, because we don't have the access to the experts or the technical wherewithal. We don't provide advice in terms of pay or terms and conditions or environment, although we will understandably feed into discussions that affect our members, and that's right. It's right that we do. Likewise, we don't take a policy position. It wouldn't be right for an institute professional body to be taking a position which advocates in favour of one government direction or another. What we do is we work within the constraints of policy, and if we can see an impact on our members, then we will provide feedback to government officials. So it's subtle, but I think it's important to make that distinction. And I hope that you'd all agree that we work very well together as stakeholders. We support each other's agendas. We step back when it's appropriate to step back, and we step forward when it's appropriate to step forward. And I think, you know, over the years that relationship has gone from strength to strength. But it is, you know, a representative body, union, professional body, quite subtle but quite important differences. And for me, it's never been one or the other. It's both. I think that's the important thing. So that's my little perspective to add to your three, and thank you for that. I'd like to explore a little bit, if I may, again starting with Hayley, the balance between professional voice and individual support.
I think just picking up on the sort of, if we look at it from the perspective of joint voices and how powerful that can be, and what you were just saying there about sometimes that we are aligned on policy decisions and sometimes we're not. And I think that's okay, because I think as organisations, knowing that NAHT and Unison are member-led, council-led organisations where we have represented elected members, and in some ways ISBL, I think, run in a similar way, because you have your trustees and you have your board who are elected perhaps not elected in quite the same way, but are representative members of the sector, who are our sort of sounding boards, who we look to. So you mentioned there about that ISBL don't do position statements. Well, the position statements that come from ASCL are from our elected members making those decisions, looking at the evidence, talking to either DFE officials or looking at papers, looking at research, and making those fundamental decisions to make as broad a decision as they can that incorporate primary schools, special schools, middle schools, APs, and all the different range of practitioners, that we try and make those sort of wholesome decisions. And I think that's where the sort of that collective voice is really important. And I think there's some fundamental pieces of work that we've done jointly that show on some of those policies that were aligned. So if you look at the employers' guidance that ISBL led on and that we co-badged, that was fundamentally a really important piece of guidance, underpinned, as you said, by the ISBL professional standards, but also by the voice of different unions supporting that as well, through some of our policy work and our decision making. And I think similarly, the letter that we did, the open letter, where we were supporting as a joint voice that business leaders should have a seat at the leadership table, and how fundamental that is to effectively running schools and trusts. I think those are some of the most powerful things that we've done as a collective. And those things come from the individual voices, because a lot of what we do, so for example, the recent conversations I've had with business leaders around the testing process, the mass testing and the primary testing programs, the feedback that I've been able to give to the department about things like waste management, about funding, about how cumbersome the registration process has come from members and has come from business leaders that I've spoken to, telling us the exact detail of what it is that's causing them an issue, so we can put those views back. And I think it's important that we have that individual contact, but also that collective voice as our organisations, but also as a collective of organisations working together to overcome some of the issues that are affecting everybody. And I think the pandemic has shone a light on just how fantastic and amazing our business leaders are, because a lot of them have taken the brunt of this and are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. And I hope that continues post-pandemic, that we do have, where we have got close aligned policies, that we work together, and where we don't, that we've got that respect for each other to listen to each other's views as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's, I mean, I concur completely with those comments, and you make a very important point that we probably should shine a spotlight on as school business leaders during this period. Well, the whole period of the pandemic have been absolute superstars, and it's not said enough. So we should, when we can, bang the drum for that important contribution. And I hope, I mean, what I think has emerged from this whole situation is you can't ignore school business leaders. They have to be at the top table. They have to be involved in strategic conversations in a way that perhaps in the past there was an ability to resist their involvement. When you can't now, and we've got to make sure that we build on that, and that when the pandemic subsides, that school business leaders continue to be part of every strategic conversation that's going on in a school. So thank you, Hayley. Natalie, your thoughts on that, that distinction between voice and individual representation.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen. I think as Hayley was saying, and I think just as as both types of organisations, I think we recognise kind of the strength is in the collective, and that actually each individual member's voice feeds in through whatever structures we have to kind of build that perspective, that argument, that support and advice and discussion that we need for the sector and in conversations with government. So I think it's really important. I think, as Hayley said, the way that we've worked kind of over and during the pandemic and even before, we need those on the ground feedback from members about the situation, about what's causing problems, and those really detailed nuances, to be able to take that to government and say, you know, this needs fixing, or we need to be looking at this, you know, this free school meal system isn't working. And that was actually our school business leaders that were kind of front and center in that kind of debacle, shall I say, kind of right back at the beginning of all of this. And I think as well as you've both kind of said, I think, you know, always really, but ever more so, I think school leaders and school business leaders have kind of come to the fore as such a critical part of that school senior leadership team. And I think, you know, in terms of NHT, what's really wonderful obviously is that we have that kind of diverse mix of school leadership. So we have school business leaders, and we've had our head teachers, and we've got our deputy and assistant heads all involved in our membership. And, you know, we've heard from head teacher members about just, you know, absolutely singing the praises of their school business leaders and saying, you know, I couldn't have managed this without them. You know, I knew they were really valuable, but this has just shown me exactly how much I need their support and rely on them. And I think, you know, often they can be kind of in the background, just getting on with the work. And I think this has really given them the opportunity, and our other members as well within our membership, to really kind of highlight the critical role that they have been playing, they'll continue to play at both at individual and at kind of a sector level as well. So I think that's kind of really important to pull out and kind of make sure that we continue to mark. And I think, again, as we've kind of touched on, that the need to kind of work collectively, and Hayley cited some really great examples and of ways that we've already done that, and pieces of work. And, you know, I'd kind of highlight as well the work that we did around school governance and the expectations, and ensuring that governors, you know, another key stakeholder kind of in the sector, really engage with school business leaders and recognise the value and the need for them, and what they're bringing, and the information that they can provide to support governors in their kind of critical role as well. So I think that's really important to kind of make sure that we're all kind of having that collective voice where appropriate. And I think, you know, more often than not, we're aligned, if not exactly, but in general principles. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Natalie. That's really, really helpful. And again, I, you know, completely concur with your views about the power of that collective voice. And it feels like we've been able to do that, and perhaps the pandemic, you know, has provided us with an opportunity to say things in a very united way, which is I think really, really helpful. Jon, your reflections on you know, the distinct roles that that unions play in terms of, you know, the sector voice for your members, and then the individual support that you offer each of your members.
I think it comes down to how much I think first it's worth saying, I mean, Hayley said something really important, which is about how we work together and also respect the differences, because we do come at things with slightly different unions. People join the different unions for different reasons, and for our relationship with you as a professional body. And I think it's important that we can work together as much as possible. And sometimes we need to step back and say, well, you know, our relationship to a school is slightly different from another organisation's relationship to a school. But as long as we treat each other with respect and work together, I think that's quite important, because that allows you then to represent the individuals within the collective. And I think that's important. We are collectives, but nonetheless, members pay subscriptions to get a service. And I think that's really important, that we don't completely ignore everyone's views. And particularly at times of, you know, when you're struggling, there's a pandemic going on, it's very easy to reach for the quick solutions and ignore the voices that don't agree with you. And I think that's been one of the lessons we're trying to learn for this, you know, with social media and all the background noise that you get during this whole process. How do you ensure that the individual voice gets heard? And I think, as Natalie and Hayley have said, what's really useful is being able to use individual case studies to ministers. Ministers are statisticed out. You know, every day there's another statistic. There are huge numbers flying about, and particularly when you're working in the field, we all do. You know, statistics are vital. The finance, the figures, you know, they're really important. But actually, what's really helpful in getting across to ministers is case studies and individual stories. You know, as a human race, we work well on stories. We're brought up from when we're very young to listen to stories, to understand that. And in an educational context, that's really important. So getting that member voice out to ministers, out to senior officials, and talking through how that works. You know, the voice of the unintended consequence, which is the way you tend to have to talk to ministers, because you don't want to tell ministers they're necessarily wrong in their decision, but you can point out that there may be some unintended consequences of the decision they've made, which is an easier way to phrase out some of those stories and tease out the individual case and how that relates to the bigger picture.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. You make some really important points there. I'd just like to offer my perspective on this area. I think again, this is the tightrope that we walk as an institute. So, you know, I've talked before about not taking policy positions, but we can't ignore the impact of policy and the impact that it has on our members. So, you know, our members are very interested to hear from us when they're concerned, or when they can see something having a detrimental impact on their operations. But the way I would describe our role as an institute is we are the conduit between policy and practice. So we talk to frontline practitioners, we listen carefully to their concerns and their challenges, and we feed that back to the decision makers. And likewise, we take the insights that we have, that we are privileged to have, and where we can, and where we're permitted to do so, we share those insights with our members, and we look for a reaction to policy direction. And in turn, the loop goes round, and we go back to officials and say, this is what our members think about this. This is the impact it could have, or this is the impact that it is having. So it's very much keeping that that loop going in terms of policy evolution, impact on the ground, feedback to policymakers, and so forth. So it feels like we don't need to take a firm position on a particular policy area, but we can act as critical friends to government, and quite often those concerns are ones that are already being raised by NAHT, ASCL, and Unison. So it almost adds more weight to the argument that's coming from our members without us wading in in a too heavy-handed way. And again, that's for me where the relationships works really well. So we can be a little bit a bit softer, a bit more discreet, because that's our role, and but we can still feed into the conversation. That's been a really helpful discussion. I'm going to move on, if I may, to an area which is close to the Institute's heart, and that's around minimum standards, qualifications and experience, and CPD. And I'm framing CPD as carrot or stick, or perhaps both. And I'd be interested in your views in terms of the expectations that we set of our community. Should there be minimum standards, and should there be minimum standards linked to the various roles that exist within the system? Is CPD something that's optional, or should it be an expectation that we have of our professional community, recognizing that things like access to training, budgets, subsidies, and all the rest of it are part of the ingredient, and frankly that there isn't enough financial support for practitioners across the system to engage in CPD, and we'll continue to that is one area we will continue to lobby on, because we believe that there should be more funded pathways, more funded apprenticeships, and perhaps even some bursaries for school business leaders in the way that there are for head teachers. But that conversation is perhaps for another day. But so I'm interested, and again I'll come to Hayley first, just your views on whether there should be minimum expectations of our community, both in terms of qualifications and experience, and then CPD. Is that should we be expecting it? Is it a luxury, and is it carrot or stick?
Yeah, thank you. I have to say, I feel quite strongly about this. And if there is one thing that I could do for the profession at the moment, it would be to magically get some bursaries for professional training, because I feel, as we're a developing profession, and as we look at succession planning, we know from the research that you did through the workforce survey that we have an ageing population with the sample that you spoke to. And I think fundamentally we need some investment, because some of those standards are coming out from the ESFA and are coming out from the department already. So if you look at the changes that were made to the Academy's Financial Handbook 2020, with the strengthening around the qualifications required and the CPD investment, those standards are being put in place already. So if you're working in an academy trust with over 3,000 pupils, you are recommended to have a CFO that has a professional accountancy qualification. And I know there's an ISBL partnered SIPTWA one that is within that. But fundamentally, if we are going to be able to develop our business professionals and support those, because there's lots of wonderful aspiring business professionals who are moving into the profession, but we're only going to develop them if those bursaries are put in place. I mean, I was very lucky when I became a business manager back in 2012. I was the first business manager that it was a large primary school, but I was the first business manager that they'd had previously. They'd had traditional office manager structures. And I was very fortunate that through the funding programs that I was able to do the certificate in school business management. And that underpinned my first year as a business manager. It was really, really important that I started off. I had my accountancy qualification, but that wasn't sector specific. And it absolutely applies to those sort of CFO type roles. But we need to be developing and investing in our business professionals of the future. And I also think that links really well to the work that was done in the professional standards as well, and the tiers within that. I use those within my school, and we were able to see, not just me individually, but as a team, we were able to make a judgment on where we were within those tiers and look at the business function as a whole, and to look at where we'd got gaps, where we could be stronger, and to develop individual members of the team. It wasn't just about developing the business leadership role, it was the roles that surround that and underpin the running of schools and academies as well. So it was putting a office assistant through procurement training to upskill that person, because I think it's fundamental, because we cover so much within business leadership. There's so many functions which are displayed within the professional standards, that we need the coverage of that. It's not about the business leader being the expert in all of those areas, but it's being able to have access to the skills from the team or from commercial providers to be able to do that and to underpin how a school can run effectively. So as you can tell, I feel very passionately about that, and I completely believe in training and completely believe in continuing professional development and to keep developing ourselves. I've been in education a long time, and I'm always learning. There's always new things to learn. I don't think I'll ever know everything about education.
That's really, really, really helpful, Hayley, and well, I mean, your own just sharing your own kind of professional journey as well, I think will resonate for many. It sounds like what you're saying is that you're absolutely an advocate for CPD, with, well, it's not really a caveat, is it? But with a plea to the powers that be that we need some funding to support the effort. So yeah, thank you very much, Natalie. What about you? How do you feel about the minimum standards or minimum expectations, and then the CPD? Should it be is it optional? Should we be expecting people to continue to improve? Is that carrot or stick?
Brilliant, thanks, Stephen. I think there's a point that Hayley raised about the expectations and the responsibilities, and the kind of the reality is out there already, and the need to make sure that the profession is sufficiently skilled and able to kind of meet those challenges and those expectations. And you can't put expectations without providing that appropriate support and those pathways. And I think, as Hayley was speaking, I was really struck by conversations I'd had with some of our school business leaders and members, talking about the kind of the lack of a clear career pathway for school business professionals out there, and how you know, there's a lot of debate around roles, responsibilities, and in some ways it links quite nicely with some of the issues around pay and conditions, and that kind of, what is it that each role is kind of expected and required to do, and what is it that's needed, and as Hayley touched on, at different levels as well. And I think that's why the standards are so helpful for kind of helping shape that. And I think before there was a real lack of clarity, wasn't there, and roles had developed and the profession had grown. And I think there is a really important point about you know, that need for CPD and appropriate support. You know, as your evidence is showing, yes, the profession is aging. We don't have a fully grasped, you know, this is kind of banging the drum in terms of the lack of kind of engagement from the department in terms of understanding the workforce and the sector for school business leaders in a way that they do for other parts, so teachers and head teachers. And it's like, if we don't kind of get a grasp on what the workforce looks like, then how do we know what kind of CPD is needed within the sector and what support is needed at different levels, and you know, and providing that pipeline and that growth development, and where are those individuals coming from? And you know, people, you know, when you want to come into the profession, you want to know what your options are and what support and what you know, training you can get to help you get to wherever it is that you want to get in your career. I think, as you kind of touched on right at the beginning, Stephen, when you kind of were doing the introductions, you know, different people will have different levels, and some people might want to kind of go all the way up to that kind of really senior leadership roles in the sector, and others might want to kind of focus on certain aspects, because as Hayley said, that, you know, the areas are really broad. So yes, I think, you know, absolutely critical, I think, the CPD area and aligning and making sure that, and I suppose it kind of goes back to kind of the value that we're placing, that the government is placing, and that the sector is placing on these roles. And I think that, as we've said, the pandemic's only highlighted the critical need and support that should then come along with that.
Yeah, really helpful. Yeah, I think, and I'll, in my remarks, I'll touch on the work that's required to get. See, my issue is that in some respects, the school business leadership profession are quite good at articulating what various roles look like and the role they can play within the system and the support they offer to various schools. I'm not sure that we've yet got to a place where all governors, all trustees and all head teachers completely understand well, first of all, what they need. So have they done the kind of self-reflection, the self-assessment, the organisational self-reflection piece to understand where they need support? Where's the reference point, and how do they then make a judgment on what kind of individuals they need to support, whatever they're doing? So, I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But you know, I would like to see professional standards embedded in the consciousness of trustees, governors and head teachers across the system. And I think we've got a much better chance of making sure that we support school business leaders on their career journeys. At the moment, I worry that isn't always the case. Jon, what are your thoughts on you know, almost that tension between expectation, minimum standards, and then whilst we want to encourage people to go on a learning journey, we know there's an absence of funding, which makes access to those pathways challenging.
I think the major problem we face across the whole of the sector is that the reality is that government only see education in the form of teachers or lecturers. So therefore, you know, schools and the media, to an extent, when you read about schools, all you hear about is teachers. And so therefore, with that heavy focus on teachers, I think that people come into governance roles with teaching in mind, education outcomes, and you can understand the principal reason of children going to school is for doing that. But what that means is that when you're under heavy pressure as governors, others, managers, you know, heads are making decisions, the primary decision-making process, often because many of them are teachers themselves, are their teacher focus. And I think there's a lack of understanding of the wider workforce in government, and that drives processes. So we saw from previous governments, that they expanded the whole role to talk about the school workforce, to talk about the wider professions and understanding of the whole school workforce. It's only recently, actually, in the pandemic, that government has started talking about other roles apart from teachers. If you look at the whole structure of the Department for Education, all these sections are called teaching and, or teaching this, teaching and that. So it's only in recent times that the pandemic, when actually all the other roles in schools have come to the fore, that there now seems to be some understanding. And I think we're right, we have to use that and ensure that that there's a spreading of knowledge, but also a spreading of funding. Because my worry is if we say, well, we need more funding for CPD, well, what we know where it will go to, it will go direct to teachers. So there has to be targeted funding, there has to be ring fence funding, and as we said, bursaries, specific money targeting at this. Because if all we say is there's more money for CPD, we know that across the whole of society, the people who mostly get additional funding in CPD are those in the professional roles, and everyone else has to fight for the scraps. So my concern that's one of my concerns, is that funding's vital as long as it's targeted. I also think it's right that when you have an aging workforce, you have to have career pathways built in. And I think that's an area where we need to do some thinking about what are the structural career paths, what are those journeys that people have, how does it fit within the overall school structures? How can people see this as an attractive role within it? I think a lot of people drop into, not a lot of perhaps exaggeration, but people come into these roles with different viewpoints, particularly term time only jobs. People sometimes come into them because they're on a career break, they've got their own children, they move in at that stage. And understanding the reasoning why people are going into that. Often people then stay, they love the role, they want to go on, they want to do career progression. But understanding where people came from, what their journey is, what they want to achieve, and do they really want to do this? Are they doing on a stop job, as a stopgap role? I think is quite key in actually deciding what career pathways are. So CPD, absolutely, funding important, but also understanding where people have come from and where they want to go, because that's how you develop and build career structures and career pathways.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. Just kind of pulling all of those bits together, and thank you for your respective contributions. Really interesting. I'm sure that our listeners will resonate for many of them. I think there needs to be a much greater investment in SBP CPD. Again, it's a source of frustration for me that we have seen funded pathways for executive leaders that are aspiring to be chief executives, or on a route from head to executive principal and then on to executive leadership roles. We haven't seen that same kind of support for those on a career pathway to non-pedagogical leadership positions. The MPQ framework, in my view, reflects that position. So the MPQ framework continues to be quite narrow in terms of its scope, and doesn't lean in anywhere near as much as it, I believe, needs to in the areas of financial management, resource optimization, risk, and human resources. I think so. That's at a national level, at a system level, if you like. In terms of individual trusts and schools, I think often you hear comments from school business leaders that although they're the gatekeepers of the CPD budget, they're the ones that are most reticent to make a claim on that CPD budget. So they'll dish out CPD allocations to the rest of the leadership team and leave themselves with very little or nothing. And even when they make the case to their head teachers that there's this really interesting programme, there aren't many instances that I can think of where a school business leader has made the case for a course that costs £4,000 or £5,000 and they've got that signed off, whereas there are many cases where head teachers and deputy heads have done that and been successful. So I think we do need to see how we can change that emphasis. The other thing I think we need to work hard on is apprenticeship pathways and access to the levy. I think accessing the levy is too well. It's inconsistent and quite clunky, and there's an opportunity there to be funding more school business leaders as they develop their careers at all levels, all the way through to level 7. So there's probably something that we can encourage government to reflect on. So no, really helpful contributions. So
could I just come in on that?
Yeah, of course.
I think there's something as you were talking, there was something I don't think that we've talked about, which I think is really important in terms of professional development, and that's peer support and peer-to-peer support, and just the vital role that our local, regional, either physical or virtual groups are playing, and just knowing that there are a couple of groups that have actually, where they've built up a small surplus within their group, and they've got some funding available, perhaps from some of the commercial links, that they've actually been able to do that sort of bursary route. And like the Able Ed group, they're doing a small bursary scheme, and I know that you're doing one through I think it's for the SIPS program, that there are other organisations as well and other groups that are starting to develop, because that funding isn't there through government where it absolutely should be, but there are other pathways as well. And I think it's really impressive, and I think we should absolutely give a mention to the vital role that the regional groups are playing.
Yeah, really good point, Hayley. And actually, in the context of this discussion, we're making a distinction between the representative bodies, unions, and professional bodies. But actually, there's a third element to that, and that is those regional networks that the community really value. I mean, some of them are incredibly well established. There are some huge regional groups up and down the country. There are some tiny local groups which, a handful of people gathering for a cup of tea, it doesn't really matter. They all are incredibly valuable. But again, different. A regional group can't offer accredited training. It can't offer formal qualifications, but it can offer peer-to-peer support. And it can potentially, if they've been quite commercially successful, build a surplus and support people to go on those more formal courses. But yeah, the regions and the social media networks provide a shoulder to lean on as an exchange of both challenges, tough experiences, but also ideas about how to overcome those difficult problems, and that's really helpful. And we can't do that from the centre, not in the way that the regions do. So no, it's a really good point. And important to make that distinction between yet another group which is really central to the well-being and progress of our community. So we're coming to the end of the podcast now. I just want to spend the last few minutes just reflecting on the differences between, if you like, advocacy, so advocating on behalf of the profession, on campaigning for a particular education system, and then the involvement that school business leaders, the contribution that school business leaders can make to technical discussions. So there's advocacy, which is championing the profession, making sure that we have appropriate role models that are given an appropriate platform to articulate best practice and to share innovation. There is the piece around campaigning for a particular education system. And then there's the technical expertise that we bring to bear, and we do very successfully, but often very quietly, in the areas of school resource management, financial assurance, accounting, and so forth. So just some final reflections on those three things, if we may. So Hayley first.
I think there's so much you could say on this. It's hard to know where to start. I think one of the things I'd start with is last week we had a meeting with our business leaders, and I have to say, as a specialist, I find that the most challenging, because our business leaders are so switched on. They're so switched on to policy, and they're so switched on to what's going on in their organisations, that when I have a meeting with business leaders, I know it's going to be a challenge, because I know they know their stuff. And I think that's sort of relating to that technical expertise that they have. And that just absolutely underpins everything that they do. What were the other things? Sorry, there was a few things you wanted to touch on.
So there's the technical piece, which you've covered, the advocacy piece, which is out there championing the profession and making sure that we have ambassadors that we give a platform to champion on behalf of the profession, and that for me is a lot less technical. It's more about the contribution that individuals have made in the range of settings that we see throughout the system. But I always find those stories, those real life stories from people, the most powerful.
Absolutely. Just picking up on a couple of things that Natalie and Jon said about sort of telling the story as well. And there was something Jeff wrote in an article once, which was that we need to change the story about the profession. And he was talking about teachers at the time, but I absolutely think it applies to business leaders as well. And there's no one who is absolutely better placed to tell the story about business leaders than our business leaders. And I think doing that in a positive and in a considered way is really important. And there's a variety of ways to do that. It might be putting yourself forward to join one of our councils. It might be putting yourself forward for a representative role through ISBL. It might be applying for fellowship at ISBL and being part of that. It might be putting yourself forward for one of the DFE working groups, because there's lots of opportunities. And even things like writing articles, if you're writing in sector or national press, you're getting your voice heard, and you're giving an impression of what our profession is like, and how you use your voice, what you say and how you say it is vitally important, and what you do with it. And I think as well, you can have more impact if you align it to what the sort of government's agenda is as well. I think you're going to have more power. So for example, like we know through the Marcus Rashford campaign that free school meals has become really high profile. Should we be doing school meals and providing through summer holidays? That has become really high profile. So if you add your voice to something that you think would make a difference as a business leader, there's a real opportunity for change. And I think as well, through the work that our organisations do in working with the person at the department who represents the business leadership from a policy point of view, I mean, they work on supply status and skills are the three things that they work on. So I think as well, anything that we can take back as feedback that links to those three areas. We've talked quite a lot about skills. We've touched a little bit on supply. I don't know as I've got a magic bullet for where the supply of the next range of business leaders is coming from, but I definitely think, as Jon said, that's career pathways is a conversation that we should be having. And I know that on the ISBL website there is a range of case studies there that are really, really interesting, because you can see the journeys that people have been on. And I think the more of those we have and the more diverse they are, because there isn't one track through to being in a position, there's lots of opportunities. And what's really important is having your own professional development plan that you work to. So you're building those building blocks to that role that you want to have. So, for example, I was having a discussion with a business leader last week who's mentoring an aspiring business leader. And they said, oh, this person wants to go and work in an Academy Central team. I said, well, have they thought about the definitions of the roles now? Do they want to go and work as a CFO and go down the finance route? Or are they more interested in a COO route and the operations, the infrastructure, the project management? Because those roles now are becoming more defined within Academy Trusts and fulfilling very different functions. So if you're on that journey to wanting a senior leader post, you need to quite carefully pick the things that you're going to do, the professional development, the mentoring, the coaching, the connections that you make, the groups that you're part of, the organizations that you join, because all those little elements and all those little conversations you have develop who you are as a professional, who you are as a person. And how you are, and sort of almost how you build your own brand is how I'd say it. If you were thinking about it from picking up on what Karen Brady said at ISBL conference about sort of building your own brand and building who you are as a professional is how you can invest in yourself, but also how you can invest in your team and those that you're supporting through development.
Natalie, your final reflections on those three areas. If you want me to go through them again, it's advocacy, it's that campaigning for a particular type of system, and then the technical contribution that practitioners make to important conversations.
Thanks, Stephen. I think it's about recognizing that those three, kind of, they're not mutually exclusive. They kind of all fit together. And I was kind of struck, actually, as we were talking about the SMRA program. I was like, maybe that's actually quite a good example. We want advocates for the program and about the way that it should be working, it should be helping for the sector, and examples of where it's going really well, and maybe SMRAs who are doing this work and finding it really useful, and schools that have found it really helpful. But then equally, I suppose, on the campaigning side, using that technical information, that feedback from members, that those examples of what's happened on an exact visit, using that to help shape how that direction of that program should work, and where it should fit within the system. And maybe things that work well, or positions that we might take as a union in terms of that we think it should be like this, or it shouldn't be like this. So I was just kind of struck that actually it isn't one or the other, and actually you can do different aspects that are kind of in all different levels. And actually, if you want to campaign effectively, then you need appropriate advocates, and you need to have that profile within the system. But equally, if you want an effective campaign, then you need to understand the detail as well, to ensure that what you're campaigning for doesn't have, I think as Jon said at one point, unintended consequences, and having that kind of narrative with government there. And I think it isn't one or the other. It's kind of, as we've kind of said throughout, it's kind of a complement between all different parts of the system and the different roles that everyone kind of plays within that.
Really, really helpful. I mean, I think what we're exploring there is the and it's great, because it's actually we're demonstrating that that we all have slightly different roles, important roles, and that we can work through any subtle differences, and we can work very, very in a very mature way through the any tensions that might exist between our groups, or between our groups and policy. So that's really good. Jon, your final thoughts on those three things?
I mean, Hayley and Natalie have touched on much of what I would have said. I mean, for me, there's a role about advocacy, about talking about the profession to the wider world. To be honest, I think there's lots to be done about how we get, because inevitably burgeoning new professions, new expanding groups spend a lot of time talking to themselves, or within the environment, which is the leadership environment within that, and actually expanding that and explaining to the wider world the importance of the role, I think is an important next step.
Is linking in. The press do tend to want, they are far more interested if there's a potential sort of conspiracy or something potentially devastating that's happening, that is always of more interest. But I think as well, sharing technical skills, I think if you can share a problem and then share how it can be fixed.
So it kind of leaves me just to say thank you very much for being generous with your time, and being very open and candid with your answers. That's incredibly helpful. And thanks again.